It's really a privilege and I think an honor today to be with Andrew Brunson, pastor missionary in Turkey for about a quarter of a century. And many of you know his story, that he ended up in prison and accused of terrorism, espionage by the Erdogan regime, who wanted to exchange him for the person they think was behind the failed coup in 2016. And I do want to hear a little bit, and I think it's helpful for people that don't know as much about Andrew and his wife, Noreen. But I do want to hear a little bit about how you got to Turkey, Andrew, and then how you ended up in prison. And I know that's a long story, but maybe if you could give a brief overview, because what we really want to talk about is your experience in prison and what you learned from that. So maybe you could just start with a brief overview. How did you get to Turkey, and how did you end up in a Turkish prison?
Well, we went reluctantly, actually. Our church, the denomination we were in at the time, asked us to join a team that was going there. And there are reasons for people like us to go to Turkey. There are very few churches there. Most Turks have never met a Christian in their lives. And it's actually called the largest unevangelized country in the world. So we wanted to go there and tell people about Jesus. And so we did. But as I said, we were sent there. We went reluctantly because we wanted to go somewhere else. But over the first few years, just God put some of his love for Turkey into our hearts. And we became very committed to being there and ministering there. So for a number of years, we were involved in different ministries. We started several churches, had a house of prayer, worked with refugees. When the civil war in Syria heated up, a lot of Syrians came over into Turkey. So we were working with some of them. And all of this was out in public. It was open. We didn't do anything hidden. But then at the 23-year mark, suddenly we were called into the local police station. We thought we were going to be given long-term visas that would let us live there for the rest of our lives, which is what we expected to do. And then we were surprised when they said, well, actually, there's an order to deport you, and we're going to arrest you now and hold you until you get deported. So usually that takes about 1 day to deport an American. But they held on to us for a couple of weeks. My wife and I were held together. Then she was released, and I was transferred into another detention center and then into their prison system, and had a 2-year ordeal. Now, I talk about 2 years in prison. That's what it was. But I didn't know it was going to be 2 years. If I'd known, it would still be very difficult, but I would have been counting the days down. But I didn't know that I was going to get out until the day that I was released. They wanted 3 life sentences for me with solitary confinement, no possibility of parole. So most of the time I was in prison, I thought I may be here for the rest of my life. And that was the kind of pressure that I was living with. Yeah.
And and again, we're going to talk more about what happened in prison, but during your trial, there was all kinds of crazy accusations against you that related to this failed coup. And I understand that they had these video monitors where there were these secret witnesses. You couldn't tell who they were. Their faces were blurred out. And this is the kind of thing that you had against you. What did it feel like to see all of these crazy accusations being made, and then to make them through these means which would never be allowed in any court in our country?
Well, I felt very helpless, but the thing to understand about all these witnesses, secret witnesses, many of them, is that it didn't really matter, because this was a show trial. It was a political trial. And witnesses that may be in normal circumstances would not ever be listened to. The government basically looked for and found people to testify against me, but it was a kangaroo court. It was a show trial. It didn't matter what people said or didn't say. They were using my trial to give political signals to the US. And eventually I was convicted as a terrorist and sentenced to prison. But all of that was just the mechanism by which they ended up releasing me eventually. And that came after a lot of pressure from the US government. So the trial was, I mean, to hear all of the things said about me. And so there was a trial where they had a lot of accusations, but the Turkish government had been accusing me publicly. Most of the media in Turkey is under the direction of the government. And they had spread all kinds of propaganda about me throughout Turkey for a year and a half by then. And so what they were saying in the trial wasn't out of line with all the things they'd said before. So spying, terrorism, 2 different terror groups, helping to plan a coup, and all kinds of other crazy things.
Now, the people in the community where you lived, they must have been watching this. Did anybody speak out and say, this is not the Andrew that I know?
Well, you know, there were people obviously who could have done that. But again, it wouldn't matter because this was something orchestrated by the government. They knew from the very beginning. As I said, everything we'd done in Turkey had been out in the open. We hadn't done anything illegal. And we had, you know, the police had kept tabs on us for years on everything we did. And there was nothing there that was wrong. So I think they arrested me to deport me, but then somebody decided, let's see how we can use this. And I think initially they intended to, by keeping me in prison, to intimidate other Christians there, especially the foreign Christians, so that they would leave on their own. And then also to intimidate local Christians. The message is, if we can do this to an American, we can do this to anybody, because Turkey is supposed to be an American ally after all. So I think there was that intimidation factor. As it went on, it was then leveraged for political purposes. They tried to gain concessions, as you mentioned, to have someone to trade me. And there was actually a long list of things they were asking for. So it was very politically driven. When I was put on trial, actually, one of the main charges was also Christianization. So the idea that by telling people about Jesus, by starting churches, that we were actually trying to divide the country and break it apart, which of course is very far from the truth. We actually want blessing for Turkey.
Yeah. And one last thing. So I understand then Vice President Mike Pence was directly involved in this. He was talking with Turkish officials, and that helped lead to your eventual release.
Well, Vice President Pence, but also Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was very involved. But really, it was President Trump, obviously, who was also directing State Department and others in his administration to get involved to the degree that they were. And so I think that he was actually more involved in my case than any president has been involved in any hostage situation ever. So he took actually unprecedented steps, ended up putting sanctions on the Turkish government, something that hasn't been done before. So he had a very robust involvement. And I'm very grateful for all that he did for me. And of course, he set the tone. He asked for my release a number of times and phone calls. And then Vice President Pence was very involved as well. And if the administration had not taken the steps that they did, I think that I would probably still be in Turkey, in their prison system, let me say.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Turkish prisons, because if you just say Turkish prison, you might be reminded of a lot of stories that people have told, spy novels and various things, and that's not a good place to be. So can you, first of all, describe what it was like?
Well, I think it's not good to be in any prison. I think any prison experience would be very difficult, including in the United States. But what made it especially challenging for me was isolation. Well, for a time I was kept in solitary confinement, but then when I was put into the prison system, I was put first into a prison cell built for 8 people. There were 22 of us in there, so it was very crowded, and you never leave the prison cell. You're there 24/7. So confined, very close quarters, very crowded. And I was isolated by my culture, I'm American, by my nationality, by my language, but especially by my faith. So I was the only Christian throughout my 2 years in the prison system. The only Christian I had any contact with was my wife when she was allowed to visit me. So I was had a lot of fear. I knew the Turkish government was set against me, and I was I also had a lot of uncertainty. I didn't know what would happen to me. They, as I said, they wanted life sentences, and so the fear leads to a lot of the stress hormones being released, so adrenaline and cortisol. So that isolation, because of the stress hormones that are being released because of fear and the uncertainty that I'm in, all the stress hormones keep me from sleeping. It led to breakdown in my body and to a lot of panic attacks over time. So you add all of that together, and I would have broken under that pressure. But what really took me into crisis was I went into a spiritual crisis, a crisis with God, because I felt I had expected from reading biographies, from other stories, from my own personal experience with God in the past, that I would have a real sense of strength and joy and of a sense of God's presence. And I was surprised when I didn't. I actually felt weak. I broke. I didn't feel joy. I felt a lot of grief, and I had no sense of God's presence. I experienced what I would call the silence of God during that time. And so that took me into crisis with God. And so when I talk about my prison experience, I describe the first year generally as a year of breaking physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. And then the second year as a rebuilding year, when in the midst of my weakness and brokenness, I had to learn to stand. And one of the things that I think God was doing with my imprisonment and allowing me to break so thoroughly and repeatedly was that in my weakness, I had to learn to stand. I had to learn to strengthen myself so that I could remain faithful. And I think one of the purposes he had in that is that I think these things are transferable. And I have a real burden since coming back to the United States, something I've never had before. I grew up in another country. My parents were missionaries. I've lived much of my life outside of the United States. I've never thought of the US really, because to me it was the safe place. We're living in Turkey, it's a Muslim country, and we think, well, the United States, the church is very strong. Christianity is, not everyone's a Christian, obviously, but it is an honorable thing. It's not considered a bad thing to be a Christian. And since coming back to the States, I see there's been such a tremendous change in our culture. It's no longer the safe place that it was before. And I just have an urgency in my heart since coming back about the United States. And I think that what I went through was partly so that I could encourage other people who are going to also face challenges, difficulties, and pressure because of their faith. Yeah. And I will be able to encourage them.
Well, and I think one thing that's been very helpful for me is to just see how honest you are. And maybe we could get a little bit more into that, about that first year where you're experiencing something that is unexpected. It shouldn't be that way. You had probably millions of people praying for you all around the world, and you went into it as a person who grew up on the mission field. You knew what you were facing when you went to Turkey, an Islamic country that isn't necessarily welcoming of Christians. And you probably expected to face, and you did face, I'm sure, a lot of hard things over the years. So you probably had built a certain toughness, even a spiritual toughness. So tell me a little bit more about what was going on inside of your mind, where you're experiencing something that you didn't expect.
So I think that there was some degree of toughness just from, as you said, I'm living in a culture that maybe is somewhat hostile to Christianity and starting churches. So that's not something that you do if you are too concerned about being really popular. So obviously there'd been something that my wife and I built up there. And because the ministry was public, then there's also pushback. And I think anybody who's involved in the kind of public ministry we were in Turkey had some similar stories, but we had death threats over the years, bomb threats. One time a gunman came to the church and shot at me. And so, there were things like that where we count the cost. However, no one had been put into prison for their faith in living memory in Turkey. So this isn't something I had factored in. But also, to be honest, if someone had said to me, Andrew, you're going to spend some time in a Turkish prison, I would have had some fear, but I also would have had a sense of bravado, kind of like, go ahead, bring it on, because it'll be tough. But, I've read some of my heroes went to prison for their faith and suffered for their faith, and they did well. And so because of as I said, reading some of these stories of biographies, after getting out of prison, I have learned, because I thought while I was in prison, I must be the weakest person in the world. Look how I broke and how I'm struggling. Once I got out and I started to talk with people who know about these things, I think my story is actually more the norm. That I've heard, of course, of many courageous people in China who've gone to prison, but there are Chinese who go to prison and who break, and from North Koreans and Iranians. And they have a story similar to mine where they go through a crisis saying, where are you, God? Have you abandoned me? And sometimes they're rebuilt, as I was, and sometimes they're not. And so one of the things that this underlined for me, I was surprised by how difficult it was. And this is something that I think many Americans overlook. When I talk about persecution in the United States, sometimes the reaction I get is, well, it's going to be good for us. I'm not afraid of it. Bring it on. Just like I was saying, I would have said before I went to prison, bring it on. It'll strengthen us because persecution makes you strong. It purifies the church and the church grows. Well, that is true, except when it isn't true. And so people say, look at China, say, yes, the church in China has grown tremendously, even under difficult circumstances. But I would also say, look at Turkey, because in 100 years ago, 120 years ago, Turkey was 20% Christian minority. Now you can't even count them. I mean, they were killed, they were exiled, they've disappeared. And the same, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, just had so many Christians 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, and then Islam came and kind of engulfed them, and you just don't see churches there anymore in any number. And so persecution can make you strong. I came out stronger from prison than I went in. And it can purify the church. I think that's going to happen in the States. But it can also knock people out. And if we're not ready for it, then there's a much higher danger. There's a risk that we'll get knocked out when pressure comes.
Let's shift to that. Let's talk about the message you have. You wrote a column for Decision Magazine in which you said, and this is an interesting perspective you have, having been overseas, not just overseas, but in prison and coming back to America. And I've had that experience too, having been overseas. You come back and you see your country through a different lens, through different eyes. So you come back to this country and you see what's happening. And I hear you saying that things are really moving fast toward persecution of Christians in this country. What do you see happening? Why do you come to that conclusion?
So one thing is there has been a shift. I don't know exactly when it happened, but when I came out of college back in the late 80s, being a Christian anyone who's a faithful follower of Jesus and truly trying to be obedient to the word of God, to his standards, is going to face some opposition. But in the States generally, it was, in most places, it wasn't considered, you weren't considered a danger or a threat. And then you go from it being a positive thing. I mean, our political candidates all wanted to say they were Christian, you know, and come to churches and things like that,
Yeah.
right? And then you go into more a shift where it becomes more neutral, and then into really negative views. So in the last years, you're starting to see more talk in media and reaction to Christians as being a threat to diversity, a threat to inclusivity. And especially, I think of two major wedge issues that drive persecution. One of them is, I would say, faithful followers of Jesus, not just Christians in general, because so many people claim to be Christians, but then when you look at what they believe actually, or what they stand for, they're not going to stand under pressure. But I look at wedge issues, and one of them is the exclusivity of Jesus in salvation. So for those of us who follow the Bible and say Jesus is the only way to truly have peace with God, to have a relationship with God, many people are going to react to this because they say, well, I have friends who don't believe this. What about them? And so this is not a very inclusive message. And the second wedge issue, I think, is that Jesus demands obedience from his followers in a number of areas that are very hotly contested in our culture. So you can go down a list of life, family, I think especially sexual morality and identity. What we have is gender identity now, biblical justice, which may be different from social justice. And so these issues, I try to stay away from political things. I have political views, but I don't want to be talking about right or left. God is not a Republican. He's not a Democrat. He's God, and he has his side. And there's an example in the Bible in Joshua where Joshua, an angel comes before him, and Joshua says, so are you for our enemies or for us? And he says, neither. I'm the commander of God's armies. And the idea is God has a side, and I need to make sure I'm getting on his side. So a lot of these issues to me are not political. You know, the issue of gender identity, of LGBTQ and all those things, they're not political. I know they're argued about politically, but for me, it's a matter of God has a side. God has opinions on these things. And if I'm going to be a faithful follower of Jesus, then I need to say about everything what God says about it. If God says something is a sin, I have to say it's a sin. If he says it's good, then I must say that it's good. What he says about other people, I have to say about them. What he says about himself, I have to say that also. And so there's really an issue of truth right now that many people think they can have their own truth. And for those who say, wait, I have to get in line with God's truth, then a lot of people are going to react to this. And what will happen is that those who are faithful followers of Jesus are going to be called a threat, dangerous. You make me uncomfortable. You make me feel unsafe. And you know what that means in our culture now is that the person who makes others feel unsafe has to be marginalized, silenced, deplatformed, ruined in any way you can. And so I think that's what's coming for those who do try to follow the Bible.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting just thinking about what you're saying, that if we were having this conversation a few years ago, there would be a lot of people who would say, yeah, Andrew, I'm hearing what you're saying, but many who would scoff at that. But it's so interesting to me that even in the last weeks or months, I think there are a lot of people who are probably nodding their heads and saying, yeah, I'm seeing that. In fact, some people are experiencing that. Maybe somebody who's lost their job or somebody who didn't get a job because of their views, because of their faith or their stance on some of these issues. So I think a lot of people are probably agreeing with you. But then the question is, okay, so we should prepare and you have all of this experience. What would you say to us? How should we prepare if this is really what we're headed to in a much more intense way?
So first, when I talk about preparation, it's not prepping, as in go get a farm and your own source of water and store food. There's nothing wrong with that kind of thing. But if you talk with people who have been in contexts of persecution and how they made it through and how they encourage others to prepare, it's always focused on preparation of the heart. Getting my own heart ready and forming relationships, I think community with other like-minded people. I would say people who are faithful followers of Jesus and gathering around the standards that are in the Bible and forming close relationships. Because I think that having an intentional small community, I'm not talking about the unity of the church worldwide or of all Christians, that's very vague, amorphous, but wherever you are, finding others and forming relationship and intentional community that will help you when you're under pressure. Now, one of the first things that we need to do to prepare is to be sober-minded and clear-eyed about what's coming. And when I talk about these things, as I said, sometimes a reaction is, I think, an unwarranted confidence that this is going to be good. I think very good things are going to come out of this. I've said, I think of it as a dark wave that's about to crash onto the church. And there will be an attempt to destroy the church in some ways. This wave is going to be, I think many people will be knocked out. But I think if people know how difficult it's going to be, they will take it much more seriously. Many people think that as I said, there's this unwarranted confidence that it'll just be good. We'll make it through with no problems. I don't think that's the case. Jesus, every time he talks about persecution, he warns people of the dangers. So we need to prepare people because there are dangers. Many people get knocked out. But there's also an overconfidence or maybe a misplaced confidence many people have that there's going to be a political rescue. And so, for example, the midterms are coming up soon. And a lot of people are saying, well, it looks like the Republican Party is going to take back the House, maybe even the Senate, who knows? Everything's going to be okay then. Well, we do need to elect leaders who will be courageous and who will carve out space for liberty so that other institutions, so that believers, Christians, are able to flourish. So we need courageous people who will do that. Yeah. But I think that if you look at where we're at now, the political is very important, but every institution in our culture has been or is under the leadership of people who are hostile to people of faith. It's in the hands of the progressive left. So you look at basically every institution that helps to shape public opinion, where all the power is, the loudest voices, arts, media, entertainment, professional sports, big tech, the corporate world, increasingly the top levels in the military, the whole education system, government bureaucracy, the legal system. All of these are really led. I mean, there are many believers in those systems, but at the top, they're led by the progressive left. And there is increasingly no room for conservative Christians there. And so, yes, there can be, even if we have courageous political leaders, which we need, the whole culture has shifted. And I don't think we're going to vote ourselves out of this pressure that's coming. It's going to take significant effort and a long time to change the stream in our culture, the direction it's going in. So even if you have conservative government, you still have a lot of the culture that is going to be putting pressure on believers. So if you say, I don't need to prepare myself and take this seriously because a conservative is going to win in the midterms, I think that's naive. Yeah, so we need to prepare ourselves and be clear-eyed about what's really coming in our culture.
Yeah, and so you use this phrase, misplaced trust. So obviously you're saying we can't trust in our government. For one thing, there's been this concept of politics being downstream from culture. And so politics can flip with every election, but the culture doesn't. But another
Think about
aspect
the
of
legal system. That's what's also down. Right now, we're placing a lot of our hope in Supreme Court justices, maintaining freedoms. There are all these things that were never questioned before that we're now under attack in the court system. And people say, but look, we're winning some of the court battles. Yes, but look at the law schools, the elite law schools. This is where the future federal judges come from, where the Supreme Court justices come from. And most of the people in those institutions, at this point, they not only don't agree with conservatives or with Christians, with followers of Jesus, they don't understand them. And the whole idea of religious freedom now, more and more, is it's something they don't even understand, how people can have the views that someone like I have. And so for the future, you're looking at more and more justices, more and more judges who are not going to be friendly to the very basic protections we have right now for religious freedom.
Yeah. Okay. So we're talking about misplaced trust in government, but I'm also hearing you say that there can be a misplaced trust in ourselves and even in our faith or our relationship with God. And I heard you say that during your time in prison, you had some confidence in you and your background and your faith that was misplaced. So can you talk more about that in the context of what can we learn and what should be the way that we prepare for what's coming?
Yeah. So I think my expectations, one thing that would have helped me as I look back, I still would have felt the same, loneliness and isolation and grief at being, the loss of my family potentially for the rest of my life. But the expectations that I had were unrealistic. And if someone had told me how difficult it could be, that would have helped me in some ways, just emotionally, to be prepared for the battle I was going into. So that's one thing I'm telling people is, look, I don't think that necessarily that imprisonment is coming to the US for followers of Jesus. I hope not. But financial pressure, if you lose your job and you can't get a job, that's a very big deal. People sometimes, we talk about cancel culture and in a dismissive way. Well, it can have very serious consequences. And even if it's only to the extent of being looked down on and maligned and people really misunderstanding you and thinking that you're evil or a bad person, even if it's only, the character assassination, it can still be very difficult. And so we shouldn't minimize how difficult it is. So that is one thing that I take away from the breaking in prison. Another thing is, well, actually there's a series of videos that I recorded. Samaritan's Purse did these in their studio. They did a very good job on it. And I go through and I talk about 7 videos where I talk about what are some of the steps that we can take. And one of the things that I try to underline is the dangers. So there are dangers that especially can knock us out in times of pressure. And then what are some of the things that we can do to counter these dangers? So one of them, since we're talking about my breaking in prison, one of them is and I'm going to get spiritual on you here, just for those who are Christians, is the offended heart toward God. And my expectations of deliverance, of having presence, of having a sense of his voice, of having a sense of strength and grace, he didn't meet my expectations. Now, and I had a lot of questions. Is God faithful? Does God really love me? Is he really true? And I began to accuse him of not being faithful, not being loving, all of those things. And so at some point, I became aware that actually it wasn't God's love and faithfulness that were being tested. My love and my faithfulness were being tested. And God had questions for me. Am I going to, basically, when I don't see him, when I don't feel him, when I have no sense of him, am I still going to be faithful to him? And so adjusting expectations and making decisions that whatever God does or doesn't do, I am still going to follow him. I think that was a real turning point for me in prison. And I think that this is something that many, many Christians are going to struggle with when there's an increase in darkness and I think judgments from God. One of the things God does with judgment is he allows the things that we trust in to be shaken so that to get our attention. He wants to get our attention. He also allows us to have bad leaders. And so as judgment increases, and as, by the way, one of the things he allows us for people to be very deluded, to think very irrational things. People who turn away from God often end up where we are now with the whole gender identity thing. And I think that's God just turning us over to our sin. And so as this happens, as there's darkness, as there's increasing violence, and then also opposition and pressure to people who remain faithful to God, God allows us to go through difficult times. And he doesn't always rescue us from it. He does love us, and he is faithful, and we have to speak the truth. And even if we don't feel it or see it, I still speak truth. God is faithful, God is love, but I may not understand what it looks like in every situation. And so I think many Christians are going to recoil and say, oh, how could God allow this? And we need to, ahead of time, prepare our hearts so that we remain faithful to him.
And what does that look like? I mean, what are very practical things that people can do? And I know, we have a tendency in our culture to, okay, the 10 easy steps, the do these 3 things and everything will be fine. And you're really giving us a much more subtle, nuanced view of faith. But maybe there are some really specific practices that people can begin to make a part of their life that would help prepare.
There are some things. I address them more in the videos because even in the videos, which are each about 15 to 17 minutes long, they're intended to be watched in like small groups or in Sunday school classes where you can then have discussion. And even there, it's very condensed. So it's hard to just give a list because it actually kind of devalues it. Oh,
Yeah.
I know about that. Like
Yeah.
I say, you need to focus on intimacy with God. Oh yeah, I know about that, loving God. Well, how do we do that? And what difference does it make? Because I go through and show just with examples from my imprisonment how actually for years I focused on trying to draw close to God's heart. And as I look back, I see that building that love for God, that's not something you just say, oh, I'm going to love God right now. It's something that I had to build day after day. But I see how it had very concrete, very specific manifestations in my struggle in prison. A number of the things that I did that ended up strengthening me so that I could stand came because of my love for God. I'll give you one example. I decided that I was going to dance for 5 minutes a day. In my second year, this isn't part of the rebuilding process. And I did this because, Jesus says that when you're persecuted, you are to rejoice. Rejoice and be glad. And that's counterintuitive. How can I be rejoicing when I'm suffering? But he says, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Rejoice and be glad. So I decided that as an act of joy, which I didn't feel joy, but as an act of joy, that I would dance, because that seems like a joyful thing when you dance. So I forced myself to do it, and I would sing, these verses where Jesus said, when people persecute you, revile you, say all kinds of evil things about you because of me, rejoice. Then when I would sing and I would dance and I would say, I rejoice, I am glad because I'm suffering for Jesus. Well, why did I do that? Over time, as I did that day after day, first it built a discipline and a perseverance in me. It ended up building a perspective that I'm suffering for Jesus. There's an eternal reward. There's value in this. As I did it day after day, it began to build that sense in me. It's one of the things that made me strong over that year. But why did I do it? I didn't feel like doing it. My feelings are just in turmoil. I don't feel like dancing. I do it because I love him. Because Jesus said, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. So I'm saying, Jesus, because I love you, I'm going to take the step and I'm going to go out and I'm going to dance. When I have 3 life sentences hanging over my head, I'm going to dance and I'm going to say, I rejoice. So love drove that. And love will actually, is what motivates us to undergo sacrifice, to take on burdens. So that may seem kind of abstract, but it has very practical consequences, very practical results. And so what my wife would say, when she was out for 2 weeks also, and I saw that she was doing better than I was. She was handling it better than I was. So I'm preaching, I'm teaching, I have all this theological training, and my wife, she was just very steady. Day after day, she said, I'm going to spend time with God. I'm going to read the Bible. I'm going to pray. And she was building day after day, boring, whatever, just discipline. Even when we had 3 young children, making that a priority, she was building a very deep reservoir, just day after day. And so then when we're suddenly under pressure, she says, well, I say she began to draw on that reservoir. And I had my own reservoir too, but hers was a bit deeper than mine. So what she says is, I wasn't prepared, but I wasn't completely unprepared. And so I don't suggest to people, think about all the terrible things that can happen to you. No,
Yeah.
That's not healthy.
Yeah.
But I say, you don't have to prepare mentally for every difficulty. But if you prepare your heart with God, you will not be unprepared for what comes. Yeah. So that's just an example. I actually, I don't want to push a video series, but I think that that's actually helpful because it goes through a number of things like that.
Well, and I think it is. And I think there would be a lot of people who would be interested in it. So this is a series that you can find on the FRC, the Family Research Council website. Just tell us how we can find it. And you did say that there's no cost. So it's a pretty in-depth, extensive session by session series.
Well, kind of an introduction.
Yeah.
Okay. This is how I am. What the things that I did. It's not just about what I do. It's about getting certain mindsets, beginning to think in different ways. Here's some of the things that I did that helped me when I was alone, isolated, in fear and weak, to begin to stand. And as I said, I came out. I was weak and broken, but I came out strong. And so that's what I go through. It's at frc.org/prepare to stand. So if you just keep in your mind, prepare to stand, if you even just Google FRC, prepare to stand, you'll get there eventually. And there are 7 videos. And then there's one final one where Noreen, my wife, and I have a conversation because she also went through a lot of things herself.
Yeah, she did. And I wanted to ask you briefly, can you tell us a little bit about her experience during those 2 years when you were in prison? Yeah,
so she had obviously a different experience from mine because I'm behind bars and isolated, and she still had our church in Turkey, other believers who were with her. But she took on, basically, she was the only one who could visit me. And she had that weight when she was allowed to visit me, to come in and try to encourage me, because she was the only Christian I had any contact with. And sometimes that meant she was, in a sense, my pastor, you could say. I don't have it. I'm confused. I have questions. I have no one who can answer my questions or doubts. And she would come in and have to bring truth to me, speak truth to me, give me encouragement that would get me through until the next time. And sometimes correct me, say, Andrew, this is a wrong way of thinking. So for example, I was suicidal in my first year a number of times. And one thing she said to me at one point, I was very, very weak. And she said, Andrew, you need to go back to your cell and just repeat this. Andrew in Christ chooses life. So the person that I am in Christ as a believer, I choose life. This Andrew doesn't care, but Andrew in Christ, in my heart, I choose life. And so I went back and I repeated that so many times. I choose life. I choose life. So she had to carry this weight, apart from trying to, get people to pray and contact government officials and all of that. And one of my, just a view I have of her, because she was, first of all, she was held for 2 weeks. She experienced what it's like to be locked up. And when she was released, people we respect said, Noreen, you need to go back to the States, or you need to come back home, because you need to take care of yourself. Let God take care of Andrew. You take care of yourself. Because there was risk. They could have put her in jail. They could have, any number of things could happen. But because of her love for me, she stayed. And she stayed the entire time. And she was afraid sometimes, but she stayed because she loved me. So I give that as an example usually of how, if we love someone, we're willing to suffer for them, to put ourselves at risk for them. And I have one picture of her. She would come to visit me in the prison, and it's very intimidating. Guards with some machine guns and the razor wire, and to get in, it's very high tech security. So her iris, they'd scan it 2 times, go through multiple checkpoints. And so there's an intimidation factor. And together with that, there's a shame factor, because all over the media, the spy priest, the dark priest, the agent priest, the terror priest, all these, just all over. And people are looking at her. They know who she's here to visit. They know she's married to that terrorist. And so the shame and the intimidation, but she would come, and she would come to that prison, and her mindset, she'd say, I'm a daughter of the king, and I'm here to see a son of the king. And then she would lift her head up high and walk in with that mentality. So I just love that picture of her in my mind as just a very courageous woman.
Yeah, no doubt. And you're also reminding us of the importance of being in community, that you had somebody there to lift your hands up to.
Actually, I would say it differently.
Yeah.
I didn't have community, I saw my Muslim cellmates.
Yeah.
When there would be a new cellmate who came in, he might not, be super religious when he came in. Within a week or two, they would pull him in. He would be studying Arabic to read the Quran in Arabic, and involved in all of everyone who came into the cell who was a, Muslim became a very committed Muslim very quickly. And I saw in one cell, after they transferred to maximum security, I had one roommate, one cellmate. They brought another guy in and immediately I saw how my first cellmate, it's like he revived. He became a lot more zealous in his prayers because now he had someone to do them with. And I thought, I began to think of friends. Who would be the friends that I would like to have in prison with me, who could pray with me, who could encourage me?
Yeah.
And so I really saw how helpful it is, how important it is in times of difficulty to have others around you. So this is something that's been highlighted for us. And one thing is, I think a lot of leaders are under pressure in the church now because they're concerned if they raise some of these hot cultural issues that to me are not political issues, they're just a matter of truth. But if they raise them, their churches will split. And they're also concerned, some of them, that there will be pressure from outside. And so some, I think, are tempted to compromise and stay away from the difficult issues because they think it's with good intentions. I have a ministry and it's effective and I want to protect it.
Yeah.
And if I address these things, then I'm going to get opposition and who knows what will happen. So let me stay away from them. But when you do that, the intentions may be good, but over time it's a compromise and you end up diluting truth. And so I think there are going to be many people, especially the very loud voices in our society, are going to be saying that's a church of hate. And this is the progressive church, is the church of love. And many people are going to be tempted to pull away from this church of hate. And it isn't a church of hate, but that's what we will be called. And Jesus warned about this. Jesus himself was the most loving man in history, the kindest, most generous person in history. And yet people say, they said he's demonized. He's an evil man. Okay, so the point is, if they said it about Jesus, they can say it about us. What we want to make sure, and I have friends who've told me this, who are leaders, they're concerned that if they talk about these subjects, people will say, you're not loving.
Yeah.
Your church is actually not a loving church. I say, that is not true. Let's make sure that it's a slander. Let's make sure that we're loving and gracious, but let's stand for truth. And if you do stand for truth, then you're going to be accused of being unloving. So one of the things to do is find leaders who are willing to be faithful to the Word of God. Go to a church that is faithful to the Word of God, and then find other believers where that's the core that you gather around, those beliefs. I know many people who've chosen friends who do not encourage them to be faithful. And eventually they end up sliding off and compromise. So underlining community with like-minded people of faith.
Yeah. And we were talking about churches. There has been concern ever since I remember going to church that you could have the danger of mixing politics and with faith. And but what you're talking about is that there are these issues that are really beyond politics. They're issues that God cares about, and that there are a lot of pastors who are really worried that I'm in a sense moving away from my main mission, and that is to preach the gospel. And that there are people in my congregation who maybe it's 50-50. They have different views about some of these different issues, and so there is a danger of being too political, as it were.
Yes.
Right? But you're not talking about that.
No, I try to stay away from talking about political parties, because it is a danger if your church is known as being very political and is identified mostly, conservative churches would be identified with the Republican Party and progressive churches with the Democrat Party. So if conservative churches, if faithful followers of Jesus are identified as just being Republican, then this is one of the issues that's coming up, actually. It's coming up because religious freedom used to be supported by both parties. And, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was signed under a Democrat president. Pretty much everyone in Congress supported it. And now you can't get support from the left, and many of them no longer see it as a value. And wherever religious freedom, which is very important to us, intersects with LGBT issues, we're losing. Preference is given to LGBT. And so increasingly, the left is looking at Christians, at faithful followers of Jesus, as being just conservative politically, and the whole issue of religious freedom as simply being a Republican issue, which it isn't. It's an issue of human rights everywhere. Yeah. But increasingly, that's how they're thinking. And so this is going to be a real challenge in the future. I don't want the gospel to be political. And as I said, to me, the issue is more, what is God's side? And I would say to people on the left and people on the right, we need to make sure that we're on God's side. So if you're speaking about identity, now when the left talks about it, it's not political. But if the right talks about it, then they say it's political. They're accused of being political. We need to address the issues that are the real issues of our time. And gender identity and sexual morality right now are some of the key issues that the younger generation is dealing with. And if we're unwilling to teach them what the Bible says, then they're just going to be very confused. And the gospel is obviously, we want to preach the gospel, but part of the gospel is being obedient to Jesus.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, I really appreciate your taking this time. And I know for many who want to hear more, they are able to go to this website. We'll have it on the screen, your series, Prepare to Stand. Is there any other way that people can follow you? Are you on social media, or is there a website that we could go to that you have?
We don't have social media. We're still involved overseas. That's still our main heart. And in the States, I have this, I think, an assignment from God to help prepare Christians here to stand under pressure.
Yeah.
So when we talk in the media here or speak here, that's what I speak about. But we still have a calling to the Muslim world.
Yeah. So, and I know it's a sensitive topic, but can you speak in any way about what that ministry is like and what you're doing to reach that world?
Yeah, well, I think that you mentioned that there were millions of people praying for me. And actually, I think this is true. God initiated, sustained, and really drove a prayer movement that there hadn't been anything like it, where that many people around the world prayed for one person in living memory. That hasn't happened. So I think he was doing it with a purpose. That was to pour prayer into Turkey and into that whole region. Turkey was ahead of the Muslim world for centuries. The Ottoman Empire covered North Africa, Middle East, and the Balkans. So I think that God is going to move powerfully in those countries, and that many, many people there are going to become followers of Jesus. So that's what we're trying to do, is prepare for that.
All right. Andrew, thank you again. Appreciate so much you're taking this time, and I know many appreciate your message and your boldness, and will want to support you going forward. So thank you.
Thank you. The Lord bless you.